Marcus Tank. Rodriguez had exactly 3 goals when he signed up for the Galactic Institute of Advanced Sciences exchange program: avoid flunking out, then find decent coffee somewhere in this corner of the universe, and maybe figure out why his guidance counselor had that weird smile when she approved his application. 2 months into his stay at the most prestigious academic institution in known space, he'd accomplished none of these goals and was starting to suspect the guidance counselor had been setting him up for spectacular failure. The Galactic Institute sprawled across 17 dimensions and boasted a student body that included the galaxy's brightest minds. Well, allegedly brightest minds. Marcus was starting to have his doubts after watching his theoretical physics classmates spend 6 hours calculating the optimal angle to hold his writing implement. "Today we attempt the impossible," announced Professor Quilnox, preening his iridescent feathers with obvious self-satisfaction. The avian academic stood 9 feet tall when fully fluffed, which he was now, having worked himself into a state of intellectual excitement. "The unsolvable theorem challenge has stumped our greatest minds for over 12,000 years. Marcus glanced around the examination hall, taking in his fellow students. To his left sat Vextar, a crystalline being from Zephyria Prime whose species was renowned for their computational abilities. Vextar had been meditating for the past hour, his crystal matrix humming with barely contained intellectual energy. To his right, Brainhive 7 occupied 3 chairs, being a collective intelligence that required multiple physical forms to house their vast cognitive capacity. "The theorem," Professor Quilnox continued, "exists at the intersection of 17 different mathematical disciplines, incorporates quantum uncertainty principles, and requires understanding of dimensional theory that most species lack entirely. It is, by definition, unsolvable." "Then why are we taking a test on it?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. The hall fell silent. Professor Quilnox's feathers ruffled in what Marcus had learned was the avian equivalent of a condescending chuckle. "Ah yes, our human exchange student. Mr. Rodriguez, this is not a test to be solved. It is an exercise in intellectual humility. A reminder that some challenges transcend individual capability." "Right," Marcus said, pulling a mechanical pencil from his pocket. "So it's like one of those philosophy things where the journey matters more than the destination." "Precisely." Quilnox beamed. "Though I hardly expected such insight from a species that only recently discovered fire manipulation." Marcus decided not to mention that humans had been using fire for roughly 200,000 years. Correcting Professor Quilnox's casual xenophobia seemed like a waste of energy, and besides, he was curious to see this supposedly impossible theorem. The other students were preparing elaborate setups. Vextar had activated some kind of crystal array that projected geometric patterns into the air. Brainhive 7 was syncing their 3 bodies into a processing configuration that hummed with computational power. The Etherian student behind Marcus had begun a ritual chant that was supposedly required for accessing higher mathematical concepts. Marcus uncapped his pencil and waited. Professor Quilnox strutted to the center of the examination chamber, his talons clicking against the polished floor with theatrical precision. The chamber itself was a marvel of alien engineering, walls lined with quantum inhibitors to prevent students from accessing external computational resources, but reality anchors to maintain stable mathematical constants, and what the brochure had described as consciousness clarity enhancers, which Marcus was pretty sure were just really expensive mood lighting. "Behold," Quilnox announced, raising his wings dramatically, "the theorem of infinite recursive impossibility." The air above his head shimmered, and symbols began materializing in holographic display. Mathematical notation from dozens of species scrolled past, equations that seemed to twist through dimensions Marcus couldn't quite perceive, and what appeared to be at least 17 different types of calculus all fighting each other for space. Marcus squinted at the display. It looked like someone had fed a math textbook through a blender and then tried to reassemble it during an earthquake. "This theorem," Professor Quilnox continued, clearly enjoying himself, has been examined by the finest mathematical minds in galactic history. The Cognoid Collective spent 800 years on it before declaring it transcendent. The Zephyrian Crystal Masters built an entire moon-sized computer just to contemplate its opening statement. Vextar's crystal matrix pulsed with pride. "The resonance array of my homeworld still hums with the echo of our efforts," he said, voice carrying harmonic frequencies that made Marcus's teeth itch. "We achieved a 0.003% comprehension rate before acknowledging its sublime impossibility." "Sublime impossibility," Brainhive 7 agreed in their eerie unison voice, three heads nodding synchronously. "We allocated 12.7% of our collective processing power for 6 centuries. The theorem exists beyond the boundaries of solution space." Professor Quilnox preened even more vigorously. "Indeed, indeed, indeed. The theorem incorporates paradoxical infinities, requires simultaneous calculation across multiple timeline probabilities, and includes at least 4 mathematical operations that technically don't exist." Marcus raised his hand. "Can I get this on paper instead of the fancy light show? All the floating symbols are making me dizzy." The professor's feathers flattened slightly with annoyance, but he gestured, and a printed version materialized on Marcus's desk. Marcus picked it up, gave it a quick scan, and immediately understood why everyone thought it was impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was just really, really overcomplicated. The theorem was buried under layers of exotic mathematical notation, dimensional frameworks, and what appeared to be several red herrings designed to send mathematicians spiraling into theoretical rabbit holes. But underneath all the fancy packaging, Marcus could see the actual problem. It reminded him of those word problems from high school that started with "a train leaves Chicago at 3 p.m. traveling at 60 miles per hour. And then spent 4 paragraphs describing the weather, the conductor's breakfast, and the historical significance of the railroad before getting to the actual question. While his classmates began their elaborate solution processes, Marcus grabbed a napkin from his lunch bag and started sketching. Vextar had activated something that looked like a crystal Christmas tree having a seizure. Each facet of his array was calculating a different aspect of the theorem, projecting results in patterns of light that supposedly represented mathematical concepts too complex for biological minds to grasp directly. Brainhive 7 had entered what they called deep computation mode, their 3 bodies arranged in a triangle, hands linked, eyes rolled back, making a humming sound like a server farm having an existential crisis. The Etherean student, Wispmala, was performing what appeared to be interpretive dance, each gesture supposedly corresponding to a different mathematical relationship within the theorem. Marcus looked around the room, looked back at his napkin, and started writing. 20 minutes into the examination period, the chamber was filled with the sounds of intense intellectual effort. Vextar's crystal array was generating harmonic frequencies that made the walls vibrate. Brainhive 7's humming had reached a pitch that suggested they were processing terabytes of theoretical mathematics per second. Wispmala's interpretive dance had evolved into something that looked like a seizure performed by someone who really understood geometry. Marcus was doodling on his napkin and occasionally glancing at the theorem printout. "Having trouble getting started, Mr. Rodriguez?" Professor Quilnox inquired, clearly relishing the opportunity to observe human intellectual limitations in real time. "Perhaps you'd like to request a simpler problem. We have some basic addition exercises from the first-year curriculum." "Nah, I'm good," Marcus replied, erasing something on his napkin. "Just trying to figure out why you guys made this so complicated." Vextar's crystal formation pulsed with what Marcus had learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of laughter. "Complicated. The theorem exists in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Our minds can barely comprehend its basic structure, let alone its solution methodology." "See, that's your first problem right there," Marcus said, still sketching. "You're trying to work in 17 dimensions when the actual math only needs 3. Maybe 4 if you're feeling fancy." The room went quiet except for the humming and the crystal vibrations. Impossible, Brainhive 7 declared in unison, not breaking their computational trance. The theorem explicitly requires transdimensional analysis. Sure it does, Marcus agreed. Right up until you realize that 14 of those dimensions are just the same calculation repeated in different coordinate systems. It's like asking someone to solve 2 plus 2 in base 10, then base 16, then base 8, then base 2, and treating each one like a separate problem. Professor Quilnox's feathers began to ruffle in agitation. The theorem has been analyzed by mathematical minds far superior to human cognition. The dimensional requirements are fundamental to its structure. Marcus said, making another note. And I bet those superior mathematical minds spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to calculate the square root of negative infinity. The square root of negative infinity is a crucial component, Vextar insisted, his crystals flashing in patterns of increasing complexity. We've been working on that specific calculation for centuries. Marcus looked up from his napkin. It's not a calculation. It's a placeholder. Like when your GPS says recalculating route because it can't figure out where you're going. The theorem is telling you to ignore that part and move on to the actual math. Preposterous, Professor Quilnox squawked. The theorem contains no extraneous elements. Every component has been verified by really smart people who were so impressed by how complicated it looked that they never bothered to check if it was actually complicated. Marcus finished. Look, mens. This is like when my dad's customers bring in their cars and insist the problem must be the transmission because the mechanic at the fancy dealership said it might be the transmission, but when really they just forgot to check if there was gas in the tank. The comparison seemed to offend everyone in the room simultaneously. This is advanced theoretical mathematics, Wispnala said, pausing in her geometric interpretive dance. Not automotive repair. Same principle, though, Marcus replied. Start with the obvious stuff before you start taking apart the engine. He went back to his napkin, ignoring the increasingly agitated sounds coming from his classmates as they tried to process the concept that maybe, just maybe, they were overthinking things. Part 4. 7 minutes of chaos. At the 6-minute mark, Marcus put down his pencil and stretched. The napkin in front of him contained what appeared to be a relatively simple set of calculations, some basic algebra, and a small diagram that looked like it belonged in a high school geometry textbook. Finished, he announced. The room erupted in chaos. Vextar's crystal array immediately began flashing, and what Marcus was learning was the Zephyrian equivalent of a system crash. Sparks flew from several of the crystal nodes as they tried to process the impossibility of someone finishing the unsolvable theorem in 6 minutes. Brainhive 7's humming changed pitch abruptly, climbing to a frequency that made the quantum inhibitors start beeping. Their synchronized meditation broke down entirely as 2 of their 3 bodies started arguing with the third about whether they had misunderstood the examination parameters. Wispnala stopped mid-gesture, which apparently was very dangerous during advanced mathematical interpretive dance, because she immediately began flickering between dimensions in a way that made Marcus slightly nauseated. Impossible, Professor Quilnox declared, his voice reaching a register that suggested his species had evolved from something related to air raid sirens. The theorem cannot be solved. By definition, it is mathematically impossible. Yeah, about that, Marcus said, holding up his napkin. Turns out it's not actually impossible, just really badly organized. He walked to the front of the chamber, ignoring the way the other students were staring at him like he'd just claimed to have invented gravity. Professor Quilnox was making a sound that might have been hyperventilating if birds could hyperventilate. See, the trick was figuring out that most of this theorem is just fancy wrapping paper around a pretty basic problem, Marcus explained, pointing to his napkin. You've got your standard polynomial equation here dressed up with a bunch of dimensional nonsense that doesn't actually affect the math. Then you've got 3 separate infinite series that look complicated until you notice they're all describing the same curve from different angles. Marcus pointed to his simple diagram. The impossible part comes from these paradox loops, but those are just mathematical equivalent of asking what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The answer is you reframe the question because you're asking the wrong thing. Professor Quillnox was now making a sound like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. "Show your work," he demanded. Marcus shrugged and started writing on the whiteboard, translating his napkin notes into something more formal. His explanation took about 2 minutes and involved the kind of step-by-step logic that would have been familiar to anyone who'd taken calculus and wasn't intimidated by fancy notation. Vextar's crystal array finally rebooted and immediately began verifying the solution. The results were accurate. Disturbingly accurate. Perfectly accurate. "This cannot be correct," Brainhive 7 insisted, but their 3 bodies were already running the calculations independently, and all 3 were arriving at the same conclusion. "Oh, it's correct," Marcus said, capping his marker. "Also, I've got about 53 minutes left in this examination period, so if you've got any other impossible theorems lying around, I'd be happy to take a look." This was kind of fun. Professor Quillnox made a sound that could only be described as the mathematical equivalent of a scream. By the time the examination period officially ended, half the mathematics faculty had crowded into the chamber, along with representatives from at least 6 different species academic institutions, 2 news crews, and what appeared to be a very confused janitor who'd gotten caught up in the crowd. Marcus was sitting in the corner, working on a crossword puzzle from a week-old Earth newspaper, while the greatest minds in known space argued about whether his solution was legitimate, brilliant, or evidence that humans had somehow cheated their way into the galactic academic community. "The mathematics check out," admitted Dean Splotchweaver, a gelatinous being whose species was renowned for their analytical capabilities. She was currently a shade of purple that Marcus had learned indicated deep philosophical distress. "Every step is logically sound, the proof is elegant, and the solution is verifiably correct." "But it's impossible," Professor Quillnox insisted for the 15th time. He'd malted at least 3 pounds of feathers in the past hour and showed no signs of stopping. "The theorem has been unsolved for 12 millennia. Civilizations have fallen trying to crack its mysteries. Maybe those civilizations should have tried using pencil and paper instead of building moon-sized computers," Marcus suggested, not looking up from his crossword. 7 across, unnecessarily complicated. 9 letters. Anyone know what that could be? Dr. Tentaclus from the philosophy department was having what appeared to be a nervous breakdown, his tentacles writhing in patterns that suggested deep existential confusion. "If the theorem is solvable," he babbled, "then what does that say about the nature of impossibility itself? Have we been living a lie? Is nothing truly impossible? Are we all just very bad at math?" "Yes, probably, and definitely yes," Marcus replied helpfully. 15 down, to make something seem more complex than it is. 12 letters. The crowd was growing by the minute as news of the impossible solution spread through the Institute's communication networks. Marcus could see students from every department pressing against the chamber's viewing windows, some taking pictures, others frantically taking notes, and a few who appeared to be praying to various mathematical deities. "The human must have used some form of chaos mathematics," Vextar declared, his crystal array still sparking occasionally from repeated system overloads. "It's the only explanation. Humans are known for their chaotic approach to problem solving." "Chaos mathematics?" Marcus asked. "Is that what you call basic logic now?" "There's nothing basic about what you did," Brainhive 7 protested. "You solved a theorem that has stumped our greatest minds." "Your greatest minds were trying to juggle 17-dimensional coordinate systems while calculating the square root of negative infinity," Marcus pointed out. "I just ignored the parts that didn't make sense and solved the parts that did." Dean Splotchweaver's color was shifting toward a deeper purple, which Marcus was pretty sure meant she was either very impressed or about to explode. "Possibly both. Mr. Rodriguez," she said carefully, Would you be interested in presenting your solution methodology to the Advanced Mathematics Symposium next week? Will there be coffee? The finest coffee in 17-star systems. And maybe some of those little pastries with the cream filling? Unlimited pastries. Marcus considered this. Okay, but I'm going to need a bigger napkin. 3 months later, Marcus found himself standing in front of the largest lecture hall in the Galactic Institute, looking out at an audience that included mathematics professors, theoretical physicists, and what appeared to be at least one deity of numbers from the transcendent realm. The hall was packed beyond capacity, with students hanging from the rafters and several attendees participating via holographic projection from other galaxies. Rule 1, Marcus said, gesturing to the whiteboard behind him where he'd written Human Problem Solving 101 in large, friendly letters. If something seems impossible, you're probably overthinking it. Professor Quillnox, who now occupied the front row and took notes with the enthusiasm of a first-year student, raised his wing. But how do we distinguish between legitimate impossibility and mere complexity? Easy, Marcus replied. Ask yourself, am I trying to solve a problem, or am I trying to sound smart while solving a problem? Because those are two very different things. The audience murmured appreciatively. Marcus had discovered that most academic problems across the galaxy suffered from the same basic issue, but brilliant beings making things more complicated than they needed to be, because complexity was often mistaken for sophistication. Let's look at today's example, Marcus continued, pointing to the whiteboard where he'd written another supposedly impossible theorem. The paradox of infinite probability cascades. Who wants to tell me what makes this impossible? Vextar's hand shot up. The probability calculations require processing infinite parallel timelines simultaneously. Right, Marcus said. And why is that a problem? Because you can't process infinite data? Exactly. So what do? A small voice from the back called out, ignore the infinite parts and solve the finite parts. Give that student a cookie, Marcus grinned. The infinite probability stuff is just there to scare you. The actual problem is a basic statistics question dressed up in fancy clothes. He spent the next 20 minutes walking them through the solution, which involved the kind of straightforward probability calculations that any high school student could handle. Once you stripped away the interdimensional nonsense and the references to probability mathematics that existed beyond the veil of quantum uncertainty. During the break, Dean Splotchweaver approached him with what he'd learned was her equivalent of a nervous smile. Mr. Rodriguez, she said, I have to ask, what's your background in advanced mathematics? Marcus scratched his head. Well, I took calculus in college, got a C+. And your degree? I don't actually have one. I dropped out sophomore year to help my dad with his auto repair shop. The dean's color shifted to a shade Marcus had never seen before, which was either deep admiration or complete system failure. Auto repair? Yeah, and that's really where I learned problem solving. See, when someone brings you a car that won't start, you don't begin by rebuilding the engine. You check if there's gas in the tank. You check if the battery's dead. You look for the obvious stuff first. And you've applied automotive repair principles to advanced theoretical mathematics. Same basic approach, Marcus shrugged. Most problems aren't as complicated as people make them seem. They're just scared to look dumb by suggesting the simple answer. As the lecture hall filled up again for the second half, Marcus noticed that his teaching methods were spreading. Students throughout the institute were beginning to approach problems with what the faculty was calling human-style directness, which mostly involved asking, but what if we ignored the scary parts? Before diving into complex theoretical frameworks. Professor Quillnox had become his most enthusiastic convert, applying mechanical troubleshooting principles to quantum physics with remarkable success. Brainhive 7 had started using what they called sequential simple logic instead of their traditional parallel processing approach. Even Vextar was experimenting with linear, step-by-step problem solving instead of his species' traditional crystal matrix calculations. Rule 2, Marcus announced to the packed auditorium, never be afraid to ask if the emperor's wearing clothes. Sometimes the most complicated problems in the universe are just simple problems wearing fancy hats. The audience laughed, took notes, and several students immediately began applying this principle to their own research projects. Marcus looked out at the sea of eager faces, beings from across the galaxy who had come to learn human problem-solving techniques from a college dropout who fixed cars for a living, and couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the obvious answer really was the right answer. Even if it took the rest of the galaxy 12,000 years to figure that out,